Whenever you do any kinds of fiber arts project, be it knitting or crocheting or rug making, you inevitably have to decide what kind of yarn you're going to use. But how do you know what's the best yarn to pick for your project? And also, maybe you're just curious about like science tidbits about the different fiber types. I'm your gal. Because not only is like knitting my main hobby thing that I do, my day job and also my degree is in science. So I've definitely fallen down the rabbit hole quite a few times on various yarn, fiber, knowledge things, and I'd love to share that info with you in a very fun and cool YouTube video. So the structure of this video is we're going to break down the yarn types into 3 groups, and we're going to go with like 3, 2, and then 1 in each group. So the first group is going to be animal fibers, then we're going to go plant fibers, and then we're going to go synthetic. And then after I tell you all the cool things about yarn and what they're good for, I'll give you kind of a quick snapshot of all of the cool ways you can use the yarn and my like recommended project types for each yarn. So, starting off strong with animal fibers, we're going to start with what we most commonly associate with knitting or crocheting, wool. So, wool is very cool, and it shares a lot of properties with any other animal fiber, primarily animal-mammal fibers. So, basically it's hair, which is why it shares the same properties with other mammals. Some examples of projects where I used wool would be the cranberry cardigan, my castle cowl, and this garden hood, where I used a combination of wool yarn and mohair, and mohair gives it that kind of halo-y look. And actually something really cool and kind of crazy about wool is sometimes people don't know what the fabric they're looking at is. So sometimes people want to check, is this fabric that I have, is it wool? And the way that most people do that is they actually light it on fire. And that sounds kind of crazy. But the reason they do that is because wool is flame resistant. So if you light something on fire, that's wool, as soon as you release that flame source, the wool should like go out. And it will also probably take a little bit to even catch on fire in the first place. And additionally, when the fabric is like exposed to flame, it's not going to melt and it's not going to catch fire. It's just going to kind of smolder and the flames won't spread. If what you're testing does catch fire and spread, it could potentially be some sort of plant fiber, or it could also be polyester, which don't set polyester on fire. It will spread and it will melt on you, and it's extremely dangerous. So in general, I would not recommend A, making a sweater out of wool and then deciding that you want to be a firefighter, and 2, just don't set stuff on fire. Like, nah, please stay safe. Another cool fact about wool is that it is water resistant. So this is partially due to 2 factors. One of them is that within the wool yarn structure, there are some lipid proteins that repel water, but it's actually mostly due to lanolin, which is secreted on the surface of the wool fibers. Now, lanolin is like kind of like sheep sweat, and I know that sounds gross, but that's just how biology works. So, and it's actually mostly removed in the processing of wool. So the heavier processed your wool yarn is, the less water resistant your overall yarn is going to be. Also, side note, lanolin is actually really cool. It's made up of a bunch of different complex acids. So we got fatty acids, we got our alcohols, we got our esters, and it just, because it's so complex, plenty of people use it as a natural moisturizer. Another cool thing about wool is really good as acting as an insulator. This is partially due to its structure. So just like most hair on a like microscopic level, wool is actually wavy and it interlocks with other wool, and that gives it this like complex structure that holds in heat. But because it's complex enough and there's enough like gaps where the waviness hits each other, we do have the ability for air to blow through. So it creates both a warm, insulated environment and a breathable environment. So if you're looking to make something to keep you warm in the winter, wool is a fantastic option, because not only does it keep you warm, you're not like dying inside. Like if you've ever worn a super heavy like coat or something and you just like, I can't breathe, that's because your clothes probably can't breathe either. There's a good chance that what you were wearing was polyester, and polyester like doesn't breathe. The fibers are just like locked in, and then there's like no airflow getting through there. It creates that like warmth buildup that becomes like no moisture can get through, you can't like evaporate any of your sweat off, so you just get grosser and like stickier, and I'm not a fan of polyester if you couldn't tell. So what makes wool good for the project that you're working on? Wool is really elastic and really durable. So what I mean by elastic is wool has elastin in it, which is basically a structure that allows it to stretch and stretch back. It has a memory. It keeps the shape that it was like designed in. So wool is super forgiving to work with. I use it for a lot of color work projects because it helps a lot with when you have to change, like do intarsia. It helps kind of close those gaps, and it evens out tension super well. Wool also has some downsides, so it can be quite expensive. There's like bougie yarn brands that you can buy from that are like super expensive. There's middle of the road, and there's, you know, bottom tier wool. But either way, there's a good chance that wool will make your project more expensive than if you just bought the sweater from, I don't know, Target or whatever. You're definitely making an investment. But because of the durability of wool, technically whatever you make, if you take care of it after you make it, could just be an heirloom piece. You can pass that shit down. It will last forever because it was made out of a material that will last forever. And personally for me, the biggest downside of wool, it's itchy. I don't know about you guys, but I really struggle with like clothing sensory stuff. Almost to the point where I'm curious if I'm maybe allergic to wool, which would be horrible for me because that's like my hobby that I've done for years, and I just kind of ignore the difficulty that I have when I work with wool. But the structure of wool that gives it kind of that fuzzy texture and allows it to snuggle up to the perspective stitch next to it is what causes that itchiness, because wool, if you imagine just a long string, it also has like little spiky guys that spike out the sides, and those are what gets caught on your skin and give you that itchy feeling. And unfortunately, I just can't get past it. Some people can get past it and be totally fine, but if I make something out of wool, it has to not touch my skin. I have to have like a piece of clothing on underneath it, which is why I wouldn't recommend wool for like a summer knit where it would be either really thin or like right up against your skin, because A, it's going to be itchy, and B, it's going to be warm. So not ideal for a summer knit. On to part 2 of our animal fiber part, alpaca yarn. Examples of where I used alpaca yarn would be the gremlin vest and the Sunday sweater. Gremlin vest was one of my very first knits, and it was actually my very first design that I made myself, so it holds a special place in my heart, honestly. Alpaca yarn is super similar to wool yarn because it's basically hair from a mammal. So it's water resistant, durable, and breathable. Unlike wool yarn, it's generally softer and like not as squishy. If you had a ball of wool yarn in one hand and a ball of alpaca yarn in the other hand, I would say that the wool yarn is kind of like squishing a marshmallow, and the alpaca yarn is kind of like squishing a cotton ball. They're both squishy, but one is kind of fluffy. So alpaca yarn is fluffier, lighter, a little bit more breathable. So I used it for a lot of projects because I live in a hot state, so I tend to want to wear things that are not as warm. It's definitely still an insulator. It definitely gets it hot, but it's light and flowy in a way that like traditional wool isn't. The downside of alpaca yarn is that it also can be quite expensive. Similar to wool though, alpaca also has a ton of mixes. Like you can find a bunch of alpaca mixes that are more cost effective. Both of the sweaters that I made with the alpaca yarn were a mix. They were 65% alpaca yarn, 28% polyamide, and 7% wool. So that mix was much more affordable. And now for our third animal yarn, we're gonna throw a bit of a curveball at you, and we're gonna go with silk yarn. So obviously, silk does not come from a mammal. So it doesn't share a ton of properties that the sheep and alpaca yarns did. I don't actually have any projects with silk yarn. However, I am using this for the next project that I'm working on, and it is a blend that includes silk. It is 77% cotton yarn and then 22% silk. I would say that's not enough to call it silk yarn, but as you can see from that shot, it is still pretty shiny, even with only 22%. And it is very soft. I've already knit like some other stuff with the same exact yarn. I didn't make it into anything, it kind of stayed as a whip, but I did try it on. Very, very soft. So in the future, I could see myself making something super drapey with silk yarn, maybe like a shawl or something. Silk yarn also has a lot of interesting properties. It is super soft, really strong, and also has anti-wrinkle properties, which doesn't always translate into yarn because of the way that we basically use it. The structure that we give it sometimes causes it to wrinkle, but less so than like a regular cotton or linen yarn. And from a scientific standpoint, one of the coolest things about silk is its strength. So all you science nerds out there probably guessed that the strength that silk yarn gets is from its beta pleated sheets. And now if you're a normal person and are like, what the fuck is that? That is part of the secondary structure of a protein. And if you're like, I don't know what that is either, let me break it down for you. Really quick, don't even worry about it. So, imagine we have a protein. They're made up of tiny little structures that are called amino acids. And in science, those are typically represented as little balls. So these little balls all line up. But once they've been made into this line, they all interact with each other. It's like they have personalities because they all have different reactions to other amino acids. So that is what causes the secondary structure of our protein to take place. I had to hold this up with my legs so I could use both hands to show you. But basically, the secondary structure of our protein reacts with the other amino acids and like twists up to make a shape. And this shape, in this case that we're talking about, is beta pleated sheets. So our beta pleated sheets look like a pleated sheet. If you've ever done that thing with sticky notes where you do a sticky side and a non-sticky side and it like looks like an accordion, that's like kind of what it looks like. And then it has an additional like backbone structure that strengthens it up and like just makes it really strong. So it's this like accordion with a backbone. Also, silk strands tend to be extremely long, which helps give it strength because each of the sections is really long and it has all of these strong bonds across it in each section. So you're less likely to hit a weak point when you're looking at it. However, unlike the wool and alpaca, silk yarn has almost no elasticity, which basically means that it doesn't stretch, but it also doesn't have memory. So it's not gonna bounce back to that original shape after you've blocked it. And lots of knitters describe working with silk yarn as slinky, so that's more like you're knitting and it like kind of slips out and does its own thing. That's partially due to the length of the strands and also because it has no elasticity. So it can be difficult to work with silk yarn because it almost seems to have a mind of its own and it's not going to block back into that prettier shape that you wanted. So what you knit with is what you're stuck with. So that lack of elasticity combined with the smooth, silky texture means it doesn't hold tight, precise shapes and structures well. Silk yarn is not going to be a load-bearing yarn. It's just not. It's too drapey, it's too gentle and soft. It's delicate, for lack of a better word, and it is best used for things that you want to be delicate. So shawls, another word for shawls, cowls, things like that. And the final downside for our silk yarn is that out of the 3 animal yarns, tends to be the most expensive. Now, could you find regular wool yarn that's more expensive than silk yarn? Probably. But in an average cost ratio, silk is the most expensive out of the 3. So, the most commonly used plant fiber, cotton. An example of a project that I made with cotton yarn would be the low back lounge top. I'm realizing now that I use a good amount of alliteration in my pattern names, but that was a lounge top specifically designed to, be worn to bed or worn about the house. So I wanted to make it in cotton because I knew I could sleep in cotton, and it worked really well. So that's the kind of project I would make using cotton. Cotton is my OG. I freaking love cotton, except for it's also a bitch to work with. Like, we'll be so for real. It's so frustrating to work with cotton.
Child. Anyway, so
the reason I love cotton is it has a really cool property which allows it to get softer the more you knit it. So remember when I was talking about wool and I said it has those like spikies on the sides of it that like catch on your skin basically and give you that itchy feeling? Cotton doesn't have those. If you look at the structure of cotton under a microscope, it's actually just like long strands that twist occasionally. And it's way thinner than standard wool yarn. But I think silk is the thinnest, and then your runner-up is cotton, because cotton is baby thin, and it doesn't have those spiky sides. Cotton is also a great option for people who have wool or animal fiber allergies. Very few people are allergic to cotton, if any. I'm sure there are some people out there, because people are allergic to like literally everything, but almost nobody is allergic to cotton, and the same could be said for linen, which is coming up next, but I figured I'd just scooch that in here real quick. Another great benefit of cotton is that it's reasonably cost-effective. Just like wool, there are, ranges of prices depending on the kind of cotton that you get. But comparatively to animal fibers, cotton is pretty good as a runner-up price-wise. Especially if you buy cotton cones. Those are super cost effective. I highly recommend cones if you're doing a huge project. Also, unlike animal fibers, cotton is fairly low maintenance. So if you are knitting with wool or if you're knitting with alpaca, you cannot put that stuff in the laundry machine. That's where my laundry machine is actually. I'm pointing right to it. And when I say you can't put wool in the washing machine, I'm not saying like, oh, my clothes are fancy and I don't put them in the washing machine. It's like if you do that, you're gonna end up with something that's like 1/10 of the size of what you knit, and it's unsavable. You can't reverse the process when you felt something, which is like putting it in hot water. It's gone. You're not getting that shit back. But with cotton, throw that stuff in the washing machine all day, and it will be right as rain. Cotton is also a great choice for summer knits because it's super breathable. I said that wool was breathable, and it is, but cotton doesn't trap heat in like wool does. It's like the holes that are formed in cotton are way bigger because they don't have those tiny little fibers I was talking about. So there's nothing that's there to help like close those holes and keep the heat in. It's just cotton, and cotton just lets air flow through. So while I do love cotton, it has a lot of upsides. It has a lot of downsides as well. Unlike silk, cotton has really short fiber lengths, and kind of like I talked about before, unlike wool, there's no structure to it. It's just straight. And because of both of those things, it's very breakable. And breakable is a weird word to use for fiber because it's not like you're throwing cotton on the ground and it's shattering. What I mean is when you're knitting with it, if you have too much tension on it, it will just snap. And then you're dealing with 2 loose ends and you have to weave in another end later, which is not the biggest hill to die on, but can be pretty annoying. And if you're machine knitting, like I do, and you don't notice, then you're gonna drop all your stitches. And I will say that while cotton is prone to breaking while you're knitting with it, it's much, much, much less likely to break once it's in the final project, because the structure that we create with knitting is really strong. And the same can be said of crochet. So you don't need to worry about your final garment ripping or anything. It's just the working with it process that can be difficult. Also, cotton can be really unforgiving. Just like silk, cotton has no elastic properties. So what you knit is what you get. And if you knit a crazy tension piece where it's super tight in one spot and super loose in another, that's how it's staying. So you need to have really good tension control when you work with cotton, which is why it's really not the best thing to start off with if you're not used to like knitting and you don't have good tension control. And for that same reason, I also wouldn't recommend cotton be used for color work. While cotton does come in a lot more colorful varieties than wool does, it is really hard to get that good tension in color work with cotton. Doable, difficult. And finally, for cotton's downsides, it is super prone to splitting. If you would, imagine for me a strand of yarn. This strand of yarn is not made of one fiber of cotton, but it's made of tons of them. And those fibers go up and down and are parallel to each other. With wool and most other animal fibers, we got those tiny little spindles. Talking about those guys again, I know. But what they do is they grab onto their neighbors and they say, "You're in this with me." And so they all stick together, and it's pretty easy to knit with them. You're almost never ever gonna have yarn splitting with animal fibers, like wool, alpaca, sometimes silk, because like I said, silk doesn't have those little spindly guys. But cotton does not have those, and manufacturers have a tendency to kind of like tighten the yarn for cotton in a weird way sometimes, and that can cause those like parallel pieces of cotton to not connect to each other as well, and they just kind of go whoo, and they do their own thing. So you could just be knitting along, and then you, instead of just grabbing the whole strand of yarn, you go through it and you only grab a couple, and then you look back and you have this like random half a piece of yarn that's just hanging out there. And it's really annoying because it does look bad in the finished product, and the only way to fix it is to like rip down to that stitch and fix it. So definitely annoying. So all of cotton's negative factors, yarn breaking, yarn splitting, it being generally unforgiving because of the lack of elastic, just make cotton really difficult to work with. However, all of those things can be overcome by patience. So if you're willing to pay the price of patience and rework and learning, then it could be worth it. And if you're not willing to do those things, then I wouldn't suggest cotton. Plant fiber number 2, linen. Linen is very similar to cotton. However, I haven't actually used linen in any of my projects yet. I haven't felt the urge yet, honestly. And linen is slightly more irregular than cotton. Cotton fibers are very uniform. Boing. Linen has a tendency to have slight differences as you go along the fiber. Similar to cotton, linen is a great option for those with animal fiber allergies, and it's breathable and it's durable. Unlike cotton, it's actually quite strong and less prone to breaking. Linen also has the potential to be an heirloom piece. It lasts for a long time, so if you take care of it and like store it in a good location, you could literally pass that down if you wanted. Now the downsides to linen yarn. Linen is even more adverse to even stitch tension than cotton is. I know, you wouldn't believe it, but it is. Because of those slight irregularities and the fact that it has no elastin, that stuff just looks crazy when you first knit it, especially if you're a perfectionist knitter. It can be really frustrating to use because you're just gonna get super uneven tension as you go. And just like cotton, that stitch tension is not going to block out when you first wash it. In fact, a lot of people prefer heirloom pieces of linen, like stuff that's been around for a little while, because the longer you let linen sit and the more you use it, the softer it gets, and the more even the drape becomes. So over time, linen shifts and grows a little bit, which by grow, I'm not saying it actually like grows, but it relaxes, and that causes the overall pattern to kind of get larger because all of the tension in the piece itself relaxes, and that causes the stitch tension to even out over time. And like most other natural fibers, linen is pretty up there with the price. Now, part 3, synthetic fibers. So there's a lot of big feelings about synthetic fibers in the knitting community, and that's all good. We have space for big feelings here. And I want to talk about some of those, but first we're going to talk about the yarn, and then we'll get to those big feelings, okay? So one of the coolest things about acrylic yarn is its affordability. Acrylic yarn can be extremely cost effective, and lots of times when you start off in a new project, you don't want to spend an arm and a leg to make something that you could buy for much less. And like, let's be honest, the cost is a big factor for a lot of people. So for brand new knitters, I would honestly recommend starting with acrylic yarn. Acrylic yarn is also super diverse. You can get acrylic yarn that's shiny, acrylic yarn that's matte, like acrylic blends. You can get super chunky six weight acrylic yarn. You can get super fine silk weight acrylic yarn, which you can do sort of for the animal yarns, but it's just more available than a lot of other yarns. And because of that diversity, it's a lot easier to find what you're looking for, just like in general, without having to do a ton of like work to maybe buy something online that seems like the color you like, but you get it in the mail and it's not the right color, and then you're like, do I just use this? Do I send it back? Acrylic yarn is around the corner in Michael's or whatever other craft store. And a downside to acrylic's diversity is just that, it's diversity. Because acrylic isn't bound by the laws of biology like our other natural fibers are, it can be whatever. The other fibers are all produced the same way. They're produced by a biochemical makeup of their components from their organism. And that sounds sciencey and stupid, but basically, you know, hair is hair. It's made the same way. And then like cotton is cotton. It's made from a cotton plant. It's gonna be the same. And the same could be said for linen, you know? There might be small variations of like the type of silkworm, the type of cotton plant, the type of sheep. You know, we even have like merino wool and regular wool. But overall, their structure is the same. Acrylic yarn is whatever we want it to be. So that means that there is no, like, you can't form any expectation for what your acrylic yarn is going to be. And that can be like from company to company that produces the yarn. That can be from, like, if you're looking at the same company, just yarn to yarn can be different. And then I've even found that sometimes the same yarn, the same company, but different batches can even be different. So that can definitely be a downside to when you're working with acrylic. You don't always know what you're getting in store for. The cons of acrylic yarn. Getting into some hot water here, probably. Now, acrylic yarn is a bit controversial, it's not eco-friendly, and it's not great for you. When you knit with acrylic yarn or crochet, little like tiny pieces of it break off, and you breathe them in, and you're basically ingesting microplastics, which, that sucks, but also we have so many microplastics in us that it's like, okay, like I don't even know. I'm not saying go eat plastic, but it also kind of feels like, can we even avoid it at this point? So, not ideal, but it also is what it is. So, yes, that is bad about acrylic yarn. However, I also think that there's some camouflaged elitism that's going on with people who only use natural fibers talking about acrylic yarn, and especially acrylic yarn users. Yeah. It's not eco-friendly. It's literally plastic. But so is acrylic paint. Like, do we forget that? That acrylic paint is literally plastic that we're just painting with? And it doesn't really have the same negative stereotype as acrylic yarn does. What I'm saying is if you like using only natural fibers and you can afford it, that's awesome. Do that for you. Like, that's great. But not everybody can do that, and that doesn't make you better than acrylic yarn users. So if you're a new knitter and you've been, you know, hit up by the yarn snobs, and you're like, well, all I can afford is acrylic yarn, and like I prefer using acrylic yarn. It's colorful, I like that. Use acrylic yarn! Go for it! Like, just use acrylic yarn, man. There's space in the fiber arts community for all kinds of yarn users, and we're fortunate to live in a time where knitting is somewhat accessible. Using acrylic yarn isn't dooming the planet to a fiery, trashy, disaster-filled end. If that shit's gonna happen, it's gonna happen anyways. What we do matters, but you have to balance that with the fact that there are plenty of people outside of us, and plenty of things that we can't control. And those people who are not us have a tendency to have ulterior motives that aren't necessarily eco-friendly, and those motives play a very, very big role in affecting our planet. If all acrylic yarn users magically stopped using acrylic yarn, and all of the acrylic yarn in their stash just disappeared, that's not going to stop the climate issue and general ecological problem that our world has. I mean, come on guys, we have to stick together. This is already a tiny niche, and like literally 90, I think it's closer to 100% of the people that I've told that I like to knit, even though knitting has gotten to be somewhat more popular, still totally view it as a grandma hobby. So if we don't have each other, like, who do we have? Okay, off my soapbox. Now, we're gonna go over a quick breakdown of the project types and the yarns you can use for them. So when I was writing this, I figured the best way to break it out is in different thicknesses. So we're gonna start with ultra thick and go to thin. So starting with ultra thick, that would be like bags, baskets, rugs in some cases. We wanna go with acrylic yarn or cotton yarn. And for ultra thick, I'm also talking about structure. Bags and baskets have a lot of structure. Rugs don't always need a ton of structure because they kind of flop about. So those, take it or leave it. You could do wool for a rug if you wanted. And now we're gonna go classic thick. So this is thick, but with some movement. So that's like sweaters, blankets, scarves. And now we're gonna go with our medium thick projects. This is things that have movement, but are still thick enough to have structure. So that's gonna be like socks, boot-like cuffs and leg warmers, and hats. And for both of those, classic thick and medium thick, we're gonna go with wool, alpaca yarn, cotton yarn, and acrylic. And now for our thin projects, think shawls, cowls, curtains, placemats. Those will be things like silk, cotton, and linen. This is the only category where I don't really recommend using acrylic. Once acrylic gets that tiny, it gets really difficult to work with. So you totally could still use acrylic, but it would be really, really difficult, and you might not get the drapiness that you want. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. I hope you enjoyed my little talk, rant, yap session about various fibers. I had a really fun time. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this. I'd love to see you guys around. If you are interested in any of my knitting patterns or anything like that, you can find that on my Etsy. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you later. Bye! You can't reverse the process that happens when you felt something, which is like getting it hot and wet. Oh. You